I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves.
I write for the health and medicine team at the Wall Street Journal. When the pandemic started, I've covered really complicated topics like, the bond markets in Mozambique, and at one point in my career, the criminal justice system. And about near the end of last year, my team asked me to start really looking at the opioid crisis in America. And I guess what I'd say is that I sort of feel like my entire career has kind of was needed to in order to try to cover this. I don't think I've ever covered a topic that crosses more subject areas. I mean, it's economics, it's science, it's geopolitics, it's local community politics, it's socioeconomics and equity and race and cultural. So yeah, I feel like I've been getting sort of a PhD the last year covering this, and it's been very rewarding.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us too. Dr. Bandara, please.
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Sachini Bandara. I'm an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in the Department of Mental Health. And my research really focuses on both evaluating state policy responses to the overdose crisis in the United States, and also as part of our school's Center for Mental Health and Addiction Policy, we do quite a bit of work around trying to understand how the news media is covering the overdose crisis, and trying to understand what types of news media messages and just messaging in general affect the public's views towards this crisis. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We're really looking forward to what you know about media coverage. But before we get into the meat of the panel, I'd like to hear from Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Dr. Barthwell, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Rich Collins. I'm a partner with the law firm of Arnall, Golden, Gregory in Washington, D.C. And I'm a trial lawyer, and I've devoted my practice to civil litigation, to ensuring that everybody has affordable, accessible, and equitable health care. And the majority of my work has been focused in the behavioral health and substance use disorder area, because as we'll get into, that's where I've seen the most bias and prejudice from an institutional standpoint when you're talking about the payers or private health insurance companies. I've also seen it in the legal system itself. Whether it be trying to convince a judge or potential jurors to set aside those inherent biases and prejudices. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the comment, well, nobody's shoving the pills down their throat. Why should I have to pay increased premiums because an addict doesn't have the willpower to stop? Those are the kinds of things you hear. And those biases and prejudices are real. And I'm happy to share my experiences with this panel and with all the attendees. And I'm just happy to be a part of this event during September's National Recovery Month. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, everyone knows that almost everyone who's been here today, I have a personal or close relationship with, but since I'm moderating this panel, I needed to clear a couple clear contexts. I have had dinner with Julie, one of the best dinners I've ever had in my life. And I told her the moment I met her, when I found out that this was her assignment, that she needed to put me on speed dial. And if I could ever help her with a story, with either background information or to connect her with whomever she wanted to speak to help her do a better story, I would do that. I don't know that she is a journalist. I started out in journalism, and I understand it's a journalist's responsibility to be the eyes and report on the things that happen for other people who don't have the privilege that they have of being there to witness these things, and they approach things with a detachment and objectivity that's necessary for them to do their job. But I've owned her and I've claimed her for our field because we need someone such as herself. So I want you to know that I do have, I would do anything for her to enable her to be, to have better access so that she can report on this stuff because she does it so well. I also have worked with Rich Collins on one of his mass action suits where he's trying to establish that no pay and low pay responses on the part of payers in response to claims for individuals who have provided treatment should not be tolerated and allowed. So I've worked with him personally. But I'm going to set that aside and get down to the nitty gritty of this panel and ask them some very hard questions. So starting with you, Julie, what have you learned as you have covered SUD and how has this changed over time?
Big question. Oh, so much. But what I would say is that, you know, I guess I'd start with, since this is what this panel is about, I mean, that the stigma is real. And it's institutionalized, it's cultural and also individual. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to a drug user in recovery or not, who, you know, their story starts with, you know, I had back pain and I was prescribed such and such pills. They have multiple points along the way in their journey where there was an opportunity for someone to help them or give them access to treatment, and those opportunities passed by. And then, you know, their story starts to unravel and turn into, I messed up, I am terrible, I really, you know, ruined my life. And there's a disconnect there that's hard for me to hear every single time. There's so much more to this than, you know, what is happening with someone at the individual level, although it is, you know, obviously affecting the individual. So that's been a difficult lesson. I'd also say that I've been, because I'm a reporter, and I think it was Todd Dunn was talking about intelligence gathering, which was really interesting because that's how I sort of view my job, and how there are a lot of people who, you know, it's not that they're not trying to help the problem, but that, you know, they don't always talk to each other. I've found that to be true, that, you know, sometimes you'll be in Washington and you'll hear, you know, the policymakers who are very well intentioned talking about something that, you know, when you get back down on the ground and you're talking to people working directly with drug users, they say maybe doesn't make any sense. Sometimes these two do connect and sometimes they don't, right? It's been, I feel a little bit like this person who's kind of behind the curtains now and is hearing from a lot of disparate groups from every side. And I think generally people do, including the media, do not want to see this continue to hurt people. I just today, I'll share, you know, found out that someone that I interviewed and met in real life, his mother wrote me to say that he passed away of an overdose recently. And that was, you know, that was really difficult to hear, as I'm sure everyone here has experienced. It's something that I think everybody really does want to help with, and that there's just a lot of silos that go on because of how complicated this crisis really is.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bandara, what has your research on the media coverage of SUD shown, and were there any surprises to you? Anything that you didn't expect when you started this work?
Yeah, so I think, so our center, we do kind of two types of research in this space. One is we do these kind of like systematic scans of news media content and try to understand like how salient is this topic, how is it being covered, how is it being framed. And then the second bucket of work is really focused on conducting experiments where we have kind of nationally represented samples of thousands of people, and we show them different types of news media articles and messages and try to understand like how are messages associated with stigma or different support for certain policies, things like that. So in that first bucket, I think what we've really seen is that, not surprisingly, coverage of substance use disorder, of overdose, has risen dramatically in the last 20 years. But the way that kind of the news media has been talking about it has also shifted, also not surprisingly. You know, we see early on, kind of pre-2012, more of an emphasis on prescription drugs, prescription opioids, kind of solutions to the overdose crisis that were emphasized, really focused on more criminal justice and law enforcement related solutions, as well as solutions focused on curbing, kind of like addressing provider side behavior. Post 2017, we see much more mentions of treatment and prevention efforts as kind of a solution to the overdose crisis. That should be in quotes. I think one area for us that we're really interested in understanding, particularly with opioid overdose, is that how the media covers medication treatment for opioid use disorder and methadone and buprenorphine. And we see that there's a huge variation, like not surprisingly, as Julie can probably speak to this much more, like we see there are pretty minimal mentions of medication. And then I think also we see it's very rarely discussed that medications are underused. And from a public health kind of research and perspective or medical expert perspective, we know that there's a consensus that these medications are underused, that there are barriers to access. I think using our voice to help like amplify that message is an area that we as public health professionals can really engage with the media on. I think there's also a difference. We see really clear differences in how the local media versus national news sources cover this issue. And again, Julie can speak to this probably better than me about kind of local outlets tend to, there's much more negative coverage of medications for opioid use disorder found in local media sources versus national media sources. So there's like a bit more misalignment in kind of what we understand from a medical consensus of how effective and beneficial these medications are and what's being portrayed. So I think overall we see just opportunities for public health experts to really engage with reporters. I think on the experiment side, where we've kind of done experiments to test what types of message works, there are, like for us, some key guiding principles that emerge. So we see, in general, using person-centered language is associated with people having less stigmatizing views. We see emphasis on it, news media articles that emphasize kind of both not just individual causes of addiction, but societal, structural elements that contribute to overdose that's associated with less stigma. We see that talking about treatment as evidence-based, as treatment as working, can really shift people's views on how they view addiction and overdose. And then I think surprisingly for us, we see that framing addiction as solely a biological issue, as talking about it as a disease like any other, which is kind of a common thing we hear is said, actually increases stigma. And so that kind of increases the perception that this is a biological issue that with no solution, like this is kind of, it increases feelings of hopelessness. So I think framing addiction not just solely as a biological issue, but as having potential solutions and treatments, I think is important.
There's a lot in there about the way in which people with a substance use disorder are portrayed, a language audit, you know, and shifts in the way in which people have been talked about in the media. What would you ask Julie to do as it relates to covering recovery, and how might that help our situation? Do you see recovery covered? Do you see recovery mentioned? Do you see recovery celebrated? And what might you ask her to do relative to recovery? Well, hold on, Rich, I'm coming to you.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll say like what I would ask Julie, but also like Julie does a great job covering this issue. So, but like reporting in general, I think, yeah, talking about evidence-based solutions is probably a key area we focus on, especially with opioid use disorder, talking about methadone and buprenorphine, how effective it is, how underused it is, and what barriers there are to treatment, I think would be a key thing. I think another resource that I would plug for journalists is Northeastern University has this great group called, a website called Changing the Narrative. And they offer just, I think, quickly digestible ways that substance use disorder can be covered. It's targeted towards journalists. And also they offer kind of access to like expert sources or people with lived experience who can talk about their experience. And it's really rooted in kind of a scientific way of talking about addiction and overdose. So I would plug that resource.
Thank you. Julie, do you have any comments on what's been observed through her research or Johns Hopkins research?
Oh yeah, I could talk all day about this. It's really interesting. I think I'm not surprised to hear that there's a difference between sort of local and national media. I've worked in both places. I do think that one thing, I guess, if I were to dole out some advice based on what you said, in terms of working with journalists, is that you have to sometimes think about what beat or perspective that journalist is coming from, right? So if you're working with, because really all we are is the experts that we're talking to and the people that we're in the room with, right? So, and then we're attempting to just translate the world to regular people who aren't in those worlds. And so if you're coming at it and you're talking to a criminal justice reporter, they're listening to a lot of people in criminal justice. If you're talking to a reporter who's covering a local community, they might be, at the, community board meeting, listening to the NIMBYs in the room or, the politicians, and then the other people are coming at it from like a strictly economic standpoint. And so I think that it's helpful to gear your conversation with the journalist toward the things they might not know or not be thinking about in order to help with that coverage. I agree with you, and that the bright spot here and the opportunity is clearly in medication assisted treatment. Other people, medication for opioid use disorder. I've had a lot of conversations about language with a lot of people, and some of them are in this room. But that in general, I think that is the story in recovery, is that there's a massive opportunity still ahead of us. And that to me feels like a bright spot, because we've been dealing with this for so many years. And so, yeah, that if I were you, that is what I would try to focus on. And it can be hard. It involves having to explain, science and medicine and what these drugs are, which also is a difficult thing for a reporter, because you have to try to, really boil down some complicated stuff in a few words. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating what you're finding, and I'm always happy to talk to anyone who's looking for a little bit of advice about how to cover, get reporters to cover this.
Thank you. It's interesting. We got a comment from the panel, actually one of our prior moderators, Corey, who says that she loves to insert treatment or treatment in front of the disease. And I remember that Alan Leshner taught us, before we even adopted this as a brain disease, is drug use is a preventable behavior. But drug use disorder is a fundamentally yet treatable disease of the brain. And Nora Volkow has added to that, it's a disease of the brain of motivation and choice. I'm going to turn to you a little bit now, Rich, and the mark of shame, which is stigma, allows discrimination to thrive. When you can distance yourself from someone because they bear that mark of shame, they're different than you, it allows discrimination against them to thrive. Mm-hmm. How does stigma influence the way payers approach denials of care, and how do they use it to defend their behavior that you shine a light on?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. And I was going to comment on Corey's comment in the chat as well about it being a treatable condition, because I think that's part of it too. I think a lot of the health insurers, they feel as though they're wasting their money on these people, that this is just a revolving door, right? That I think we need to talk more about the success stories, right? That treatment and recovery works. That's a big problem. Another problem, as you say, that this stigma allows insurers, they know in the back of their head, there's not going to be as much sympathy, empathy for those who are suffering with a substance use disorder, like there is those suffering with cancer. And I've represented cancer patients fighting for access to radiation treatment, right? The reaction from the public, the reaction from the court, the sympathy from a judge, completely different, right? And we've come a long way, okay? Don't get me wrong, we've come a long way. And I agree, looking back to say 2012, and what the focus was on, right? And the idea that, hey, if you just lock up your medicine cabinets at home, the problem's over, right? The messaging has gotten better. The law has picked up, right? We have the Affordable Care Act. We've got the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, right? And we've got these laws in place. That's great. But what I've seen is in 2014, after the Affordable Care Act rolled out, the insurers were just happy to take all the new premium dollars from the individual mandate. Then when they realized, oh my gosh, we have to pay for all these claims when substance use disorder treatment is deemed an essential health benefit, yeah, you got to pay for it. That's when I saw significant changes in 2016, industry-wide changes in terms of level of care guidelines, coverage guidelines, and reimbursement policies. Okay, there's two attacks on the substance use disorder community by health insurers. Okay, yeah, if there's anybody from a health insurance company out there, I apologize. Yeah, I'm going to be a little biased. I've seen enough, but what I've seen is a difference in terms of there's a prior authorization process for most services that you seek. Before you can get it, you need to check with your insurance company to get authorization. It applies to surgeries, MRIs, and it applies to treatment for SUD. And what I've seen is the clinical guidelines. Now, mind you, the insurance companies draft these themselves, right? They create the rules of engagement, and they're the referees too. But I've seen that the guidelines, the clinical guidelines, do not meet the standard of care for the treatment of SUD. Versus, to think that there were insurers who refused to adopt the ASAM criteria, right, as their guidelines. To imagine that insurance companies would just completely ignore the NCCN guidelines when dealing with cancer patients, there would be outrage, right? So that is a big problem. I've seen change there. There was a great case, Witt versus United Behavioral Health. It was a wonderful case because it blew out of the water the level of care and coverage guidelines that insurance companies are using to limit access to SUD treatment. The shift now, okay, that's the no pays that Dr. Barthwell talked about. Now let's talk about the low pays. So the insurance companies realize, okay, the parity laws require that we provide coverage for mental health on the same level and same par as medical surgical benefits, right? So we've got to cover it, but maybe we don't have to pay for it. Maybe we don't have to pay for it. We'll cover it, but when it comes time to reimburse for the service, what I've seen is reimbursement levels for SUD treatment since 2016 have gone from on average 70% of the provider's billed charge to less than 20% of the billed charge. Yes, from 70% of the billed charge to less than 20%. And that was within a year's change. It was just a flick of the switch. industry-wide. All the insurance companies seem to have done this. And what I'm fighting about right now is to demonstrate that these reimbursement policies are creating a similar barrier to accessing treatment as the level of care and coverage guidelines that were preventing people from getting in. Okay, now you can get in, but you're going to end up in bankruptcy because when you get your EOB and your bill in the mail, and if the insurance company is only paying 20% of that bill, the patient's getting stuck with 80%. Who's going to be able to afford to continue that treatment? So that's the big issue I've seen now. And when it comes to the stigma and the prejudice, I've taken the deposition of insurance executives, and you can feel them seething with disdain for the providers of SUD services, who they feel are egregious billers, these outliers that are trying to take advantage of the system, as opposed to trying to take care of their patients, return them to their communities and their workplaces so they can have a meaningful life. That's the mindset. And so my job is trying to break through that mindset. And it's amazing, I don't want to go on too long, but I mean, the people who work for these insurance companies, like I said, these are normal people. They coach Little League and soccer, right? They go to church, some of them too, right? But they get institutionalized, and it's the institutional stigma, it's the institutional biases and prejudice that I see, and it's breaking through that. That's the difficult part. And we've gotten, like I say, we've made advances in terms of most insurance companies have adopted the ASAM criteria and use that as their guidelines. But the reimbursement policies now are a big issue. I am encouraged, though. I am encouraged because the latest report to Congress by the Secretary of Labor, Secretary of HHS, and Treasury on compliance with parity laws mentions reimbursement 22 times. Okay, it's recognized now that the reimbursement rates are creating this non-quantitative limitation on the access to treatment. So I am encouraged by that. I'm also encouraged by all the people on the panel who've talked about the role of employers and their bargaining power. And I'd be happy to talk about that if there's further questions.
Well, since I have the last word, this is the last panel there, I want to extend another 5 minutes to the three of you to think sort of broadly about the role that media can play in helping to reduce the stigma that prevents people from starting and staying in recovery. And I'm not talking about stigma that keeps people away from treatment, where this is we're focused on recovery. So the stigma that interferes with someone to stay in recovery or to engage in the activities that help them remind themselves on a daily basis to keep their vulnerability to drug or alcohol use low or absent once they've made a decision to get into recovery. What role can the media play in helping to reduce the stigma of recovery?
Yeah, I was going to say I could start if you, as the big bad media, I'll start. I think that, we're in the business of telling stories, and stories that people want to read are the ones that, make the most impact. And so I think, having more stories of personal, recovery journeys, which are actually, they're not easy for journalists to find. I do think that, we need more people telling their stories publicly. And one of the reasons they don't is the stigma, of course, especially people maybe who have had a really successful recovery journey sometimes aren't in a place to talk about it. I also think that, talking about what the evidence is showing, really sticking to, some of the science and, the very good information we have out of there that things do work, that sometimes, we focus a lot on what doesn't work, but there are things that are working and that are news because they're working better than they have in the past, or they're working for the first time, or they're in development. And so, we always need something to be new and also, interesting to write about it as a journalist. And so the more that, that we can find those stories about what's new and different in recovery, the more we'll be able to tell them.
Thank you. Dr. Bhandara.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think stories that kind of put a human face and human eyes, like the experience of people who are in recovery, and I think are key. I think for me, like I would also try to look inward into like my own research community and say, like, put the call out to say, like, we can do a better job, I think, of translating our research for journalists, of being a resource, of kind of helping, kind of like Julie said, these are complicated issues with a lot of different elements and fields kind of intersecting into one place. Like, I think our role as translators and being a resource for journalists, I think, is a really important one. So taking that seriously in the research community. And then I think, I'm a health policy researcher at heart. So I think amplifying stories of kind of policies that are successful or not successful, and how kind of policy can be used as a tool to really change the structures and systems around people in recovery and people who use drugs to help support recovery, I think are also key.
Thank you. Rich, I'll give you the last word.
Okay. Hang on, everybody. No, I won't make it long. I agree with what's been said. I think, the success stories, again, are important. I can't tell you how many times I've read, stories about addiction, substance use disorder, pardon me, and, the opioid epidemic, and the graphic photos of, people shooting up in dirty alleys, instead of, the success story on the other end. That's key. I'm like Julie, I'm in the business of telling stories too. And what I found as being helpful in telling that story is humanizing the people who are involved. And I've done that in various ways, but to bring home to someone that someone's suffering with an SUD. At one point, they were an innocent child born into this world, right? They have mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, who love them. And these people, for whatever reason, just can't seem to find a way to love themselves, right? And just bring that humanity and that struggle and the suffering, I think, helps reduce the stigma, engender some empathy. And we see that, in people who have been through treatment and are in recovery. You see that with people like Secretary Walsh, who is quite public about it, and you see how that drives him and what he's doing, right? And if you haven't walked the walk, you don't have that same drive. But if you can show somebody that walk, and you can show them what it was like to walk through that journey, that will help.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining me on this panel and bringing your particular insights into this. Julie, thank you for the work on carrying that message. You talked about being there and carrying the message, and that's what you all do when you're at your best. Some members of your profession don't do that. They bring and put a little bit more of themselves into it. Even sometimes when they're not telling us that it's an editorial, and so we have to watch out for that. But I really always appreciated how much you bring that objective view to the storytelling. And Dr. Bhandara, the work that you're doing to help us understand that, and the fact that you can recognize that your peers need a bit more instruction on how they can be helpful. I mean, I talked earlier yesterday about, we funded a study called the Persistent Effective Treatment Survey, and we spent millions of dollars to see how the gains made in treatment eroded, rather than trying to define what threshold we had needed to take people to where they could build in a self-directed way on the gains that were made. And there was so much discussion about self-directed care and self-directed involvement over the last 2 days. I know that we've come a very long way in the last 25 years away from studies that look at how quickly the effective treatment wears off, as opposed to how we build on it. And Rich, thank you for what you're doing every day on behalf of providers to try to get us paid for the things that we do. While there may be some that are motivated to line their pockets with money they didn't earn, people should be able to be paid for the work that they do, and we should not begrudge them if they put forth the effort. So thank you for that.